Hi, I'm Zach Waters, and welcome to another episode of What the F Stop Photo Talk, where I chat to photographers about their life and connection to the world through photography. Back in the day, in the 90s, for me, Roger Hutchings was a formidable character. I don't normally do long intros for these podcasts, but I just feel to really give you a feel of who Roger Hutchings is as a photographer, I wanted to just summarize some of his achievements, not just his awards. I wanted to give you some idea about who Roger Hutchings is as a photojournalist and what he's covered as a summary in brief. And I'm not including his awards and his exhibitions and other publications, as well as other stories he's covered. Photographer Roger Hutchings was born in Winchester, England. While studying estate management at Portsmouth Polytechnic, he became increasingly interested in photography. During his degree, he produced a report on substandard inner city housing conditions and chose to illustrate it with his own photographs. This experience sparked the realization that photography could be a powerful tool for exploring social issues. He eventually decided to change direction and pursue photography full-time. From 1980 to 82, he studied on the renowned documentary photography course at Newport College in Wales, which had been recently founded by Magnum photographer David Hearn. This marked the beginning of his formal training as a photojournalist. From around 1979, he covered a variety of domestic-based stories, from the miners' strike, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Brixton riots, to an array of political party rallies. One of his most important domestic projects, entitled Thatcher's Britain, focused on the effects of Margaret Thatcher's social and economic policies on the young people in Britain, especially in areas impacted by deindustrialisation, unemployment and poverty. Thatcher's children continued over a period of 17 years until Labour won the general election in 1997. In 1983, he began freelancing for The Observer. From 1996 to 1992, he moved further afield and began to work on more international-based stories. He photographed the civil war in Sudan, the Polisario Front fighting Morocco in the Western Sahara, the civil war in Sri Lanka. He covered Haiti's first election after the fall of the Duvalier family, worked on a story about social change amongst the Maasai in Kenya, the election campaign of Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan, covered the Velvet Revolution in Prague, documented the consequences of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Berlin the book published by Federico Motta in 1999, photographed the Gulf War in Saudi Arabia, documented Hindu and Muslim communal strife in northern India, worked on a story about bonded labour in India, photographed the collapse of the Mengistu regime and the fall of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, photographed Cambodia's attempt to return to democracy, pursued a story on the Turkish-Iraqi border to photograph Kurdish refugees following the Gulf War. In 1992 to 1997, he undertook a series of 9 trips to Bosnia documenting the civil war. From 1992 to 1995, he worked extensively in Bosnia during the Yugoslav wars. He photographed Sarajevo during the siege and in other areas affected by ethnic violence. His focus was on the lives of civilians during the conflict, including refugees, children and other people living under the shelling. In 1994 to 1996, he worked on a long-form documentary in southeastern Turkey photographing the war between the Kurdish PKK and the Turkish army. In 1996, he documented the demolition of nuclear installations at Almaty Ground Zero in Kazakhstan. In 1997, his book Ataturk's Children, published by Cassell, which documented the campaign for the eradication of polio in India. In 1998, he photographed the problem of arsenic poisoning in the Ganges Delta. Around 1999, he began moving away from his traditional photojournalism, where he pursued other editorial commissions on fashion-based photography. He was commissioned for projects by high-profile clients, including Giorgio Armani. In 2002, the book Armani Backstage was published by Federico Motta. In addition to his photographic practice, Roger has been very active in education. He has taught photojournalism and documentary photography at several institutions, including the University of the Arts in London. He's been chair and tutor at the World Press Photo Awards. His archive spans conflict, social change, fashion and portraiture, with projects based in all over the world from the late 70s to the early 2000s. I was really pleased that Roger took the time to have a chat with me, eager to talk to him, to find out how he connected to the world through his photography, but also finding out how working in conflict zones affected his life then and in the long term to now.
There's no point being anywhere unless, as a photographer, particularly in a conflict zone, if you can't capture and record the essence of what you believe the situation to be, the tragedy, the inhumane, the grief, the aggression. And I think, through being preoccupied with this on a 24/7 basis, really, I mean, I would say that all of my time since I started photographing, even, walking to the underground or swimming or something, you're actually framing and thinking about the relationship between shapes and parts and meanings and putting them into a frame. And in my case, that was a 35mm frame most of the time.
And we talked about his Newport days under the guidance of photographer David Hearn.
I think his biggest influence was to create the understanding and belief that you could do it if you really wanted to do it. And the one thing that David always impressed on us was it was important to photograph things that you were very interested in or very passionate about, and perhaps which you knew a lot about. Because in such a way, if you understand and are somewhat fascinated by your subject, you will make better pictures because you understand the meaning of the things happening around you, their significance.
He shed light on one of the most important books he's ever read.
When I was 21, one of my cousins, for my 21st birthday, gave me The World of Henri Cartier-Bresson, which it was a revelation to me. And I saw how photography could be used in a reportage sense, how it could actually, effectively what the documentary photographer became was a kind of, an historian. And that's how I think very much about strong documentary photography. It is actually an historical document.
We also discussed his deep love of composition.
I think I've always been quite obsessed by...
Do you know what? You can tell. I've always thought you were obsessed with it. And I mean that with pure respect,
Well, I've always sought to bring together content and form so that I have this marriage of the meaning, the information that the photograph is imparting, but together with a kind of very strict, disciplined, precise way of arranging the elements within the picture, hopefully making a more compelling image. It actually translates the point, what I'm trying to say in the picture, more powerfully to any potential audience.
The day came for a chat, and I asked him what he was up to.
In terms of actually going out and making pictures, not very much. I tend to spend most of my time working on my archive, digitizing, revisiting, over 40 years worth of work. In its own way, it seems a rather passive and sedentary thing, but it's very exciting too, discovering new pictures that were overlooked at the time when they were shot. Probably because, one was working on an assignment which had a very specific brief, and in the course of producing those pictures to fulfill the brief, I might come across something that just personally interested me and photographed it, but it probably wouldn't have been identified, marked up, red penciled then because, it was exterior to the client's requirements.
You must have quite a vast archive. Majority of that must be black and white, is it?
I've got 2 rooms full of negatives and contact sheets and print.
Mainly black and white?
90% black and white.
Black and white takes up quite a considerable amount of space.
Huge amount of space. We used to cull when we did colour shoots. Obviously, we're working mostly in transparency back in the 80s and 90s. We do an A edit and a B edit. 40 pictures in an A edit would be a big one, and maybe 20 outtakes, and the rest of the images got thrown away. Something with hindsight, I think, was perhaps slightly unwise. Although, when shooting positive film then, we did a lot of bracketing because the precision and exposure was so demanding just to get that right degree of saturation. So a lot of things that you threw out were actually either under or overexposed.
Yeah. Do you still have access to a darkroom?
Wild horses wouldn't drag me into a darkroom today.
Do you not miss the smell of stop bar?
No. It's still on a lot of the contact sheets that I got left over from the Observer.
That smell does linger, doesn't it?
Well, the smell and also the chemicals in it as well. I know after I've been handling old contact sheets that quite often I have to wash my hands, and it's definitely quite an acrid thing. It's obviously that fixation process. You know how newspapers work very fast. They didn't wash every contact sheet like we would have done if we were working in our own labs, for half an hour in a tank, which, you know, you might have.
There's sort of a nostalgic smell, though, of the past, isn't it?
Well,
What are you scanning your work on?
well, this is interesting. For a long time, I've used a Nikon Coolscan 9000, but more recently, I've switched over to copying my negs using a Nikon with a macro lens and a slide copier, which I find produces really satisfactory results, especially in black and white and positive. A little bit tricky when you're dealing with color negative.
How are you lighting that with a light box behind it?
I light it with a thing called a light cube. It's kind of a small video light, really, which you can, you've got 9 different levels of illumination, and you pump the light through a diffuser.
You're not the first photographer I've heard do say that. I think Brian Harris does that as well. He's been talking about.
It's just so much faster. I mean, Nikon scanners, they are very good scanners, as far as I can see, other than the Hasselblad scanners. You know, they were the best you can get.
How do you see the difference in quality from the Coolscan to the camera?
I don't see any discernible difference.
Interesting.
I mean, obviously, you know, the thing is with the Coolscan, you can do medium format.
Yeah.
Which I don't do on the camera.
Yeah. The 9000 was a medium format as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, 6.6, 6.7, 6.9.
Yeah, I've got the 4000, which is just 35mm, and it's pretty good. It's still going, actually.
I used to find that the Nikon software was pretty tricky and inconsistent at times.
Yeah.
So I've always been a bit of a fan of ViewScout and SilverScan.
Roger, you're renowned for your war and your frontline work in the 90s, and as you're aware, we've got a major scenario going on in Russia and Ukraine at the minute. How do you feel when you're looking at that? Are you getting an itch still in your system to sort of look at it?
No, not at all. I mean, back towards the end of the 90s, I was coming around to making a philosophical decision that I've had enough photographing conflict and, you know, other situations of extremity which involves people's lives. And then in 99, a very close friend of mine was murdered at a Serb checkpoint when trying to drive into Kosovo. He was a journalist called Gabriel Gruner from Stern magazine, with whom I've worked a lot during the Bosnian War, and we had become very good friends. And at that point, I just felt I made the decision that, okay, I've done this for quite a long time. I've had a pretty good run. I've had a few narrow escapes, like being blown up by a landmine in Sudan, but I felt it was time to call it quits, really. Although I watch the situation in Ukraine both with horror and fascination and hope and anxiety, I don't have any desire to be there. I know 1 or 2 older photographers that I've known are out there, and 1 or 2 friends who are journalists are there, and frankly, I worry about them.
Do you think the journalists are safer now than what they were back then?
No. I think over the years, the idea that the journalist was a kind of independent, objective observer has changed. And now, certainly in the Balkan Wars, journalists were seen as propagandists for one side or the other, and they therefore became a target. And I think that's why in recent times you've seen an increasing rise in the number of journalists who've been either injured or killed, you know, in conflicts over the last 20, 25 years.
Bosnia was a pretty brutal place. When you come out of that, did it affect you, like in mental health-wise?
Well, it's difficult to say if it was just Bosnia. I mean, I delved into a lot of extremity in the years before that, in other wars in Ethiopia and the Sudan, Sri Lanka, the first Gulf War. I think perhaps cumulatively, there are a lot of impressions and scars, kind of dislocation from normality, which can be set in place in your mind. And today people, it's identified as post-traumatic stress disorder. My guess is, to an extent, I felt I had a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, which was part of the healing process of, if healing is the right word, to stop doing that kind of work and to move on to photographing things which were more life-enhancing, I should say. Although, look, I must underline the importance of this kind of work, the importance of this documentation, the importance of the history of doing these things, of there being a record, of there being witnesses, particularly coming from, trusted sources, provenance, which is known, recognized, and accepted as not being any kind of fake news. So people who do it today, incredibly courageous, but the risks they run, it seems to me, are bigger than they have been perhaps ever before.
Did you ever reflect back and wonder, how the hell did I get into that?
I had a pretty conventional middle-class upbringing, you would say. I'd always had a strong interest in photography. My grandfather was a businessman, but also an extremely keen, I wouldn't say pioneer in photography, but an early adopter. He had his own darkroom, and we're talking about in the 1890s. An interesting story. There's a picture of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. The grandfather I'm talking about was my paternal grandfather. It's a picture of her that he sold her for sixpence because he used to go up to people in the street in this town, Winchester, where I used to live, or where the family came from, and sell prints, they were unusual things to have in those days. It's a piece of serendipity that he photographed a woman who was the mother of the woman that my father married. But anyway, going back to that. So I had this keen interest, had all his equipment in the loft at home, his large format cameras, his tripods, his old enlargers, his glass plates. Latterly, then he moved into shooting with 35mm and was worked very early on in color using, I think Kodachrome was 12 ASA when it first came out. That's quite a challenge. So there was that connection there. So when I was 15, 16, I was taking a lot of pictures. But for one reason, and in fact, I joined when I was 17 a thing called the Bureau of Freelance Photographers, which was effectively a kind of correspondence course in photography who used to send out a market newsletter about various market opportunities for people. And as a consequence of that, I sold my first pictures when I was, about 18. I saw that they needed pictures of a magazine called Heavy Horse, needed pictures of Shire horses, these heavy horses. So I went out to a country fair, took some pictures of a ploughing match, sent them off, having used my darkroom, which was in the attic, extremely hot, glazed them on some old bits of plate glass using, I don't know what it was, probably chalk and talcum powder to clean up the glass first of all, and received a nice letter, which I still have, saying, "Thank you for the excellent pictures. The sum of 1 guinea does not seem a lot for such excellent work." So that was my first sale, but it kind of stopped there. Social pressure, family pressure, the idea of how would you ever make a living as a photographer kind of was usurped by the fact that I went off to university, did a degree in estate management, and then became a chartered surveyor, which I did practice as until I was in my late 20s, when I realized that I couldn't possibly do that for the rest of my life. And I decided to quit the job, applied to various art colleges, luckily received a place at School of Documentary Photography in Newport, went there with a lot of optimism, just hoped that I might be able to make it work as a vocation for me.
What were you looking at then, picture-wise? What were you trying to shoot?
I was interested then. It was the Thatcher era. She'd just been elected in 79. And the 70s were a tough time, sort of economically and socially. And I kind of wanted to get an insight into myself and the essence of Britishness. I'd studied politics, sociology, and economics at A-level. And when I was doing my degree, I'd done a project about housing conditions, which I'd used my sort of interest in photography to illustrate. I was just interested in finding out more about myself, about the politics of Britain, the sociology of Britain. I suppose, everything I did was kind of, in a way, opposite to the upbringing I had. I wanted to put myself into new situations, meet different people. Moving from a cosy Hampshire town to living in the dock area of Newport in South Wales was in itself an extreme change.
David Hearn was the lecturer there.
Well, David Hearn set up the school.
That's right, yeah.
In Newport.
And you were influenced by Bresson, I presume, as well?
Well, the thing is, I suppose when I started out in photography, I was quite sort of, would the word be pictorialist, interested in landscape, very traditional. But when I was 21, one of my cousins for my 21st birthday gave me The World of Henri Cartier-Bresson, which it was a revelation to me. And I saw how photography could be used in a reportage sense, how it could actually, effectively what the documentary photographer became was a kind of, an historian. And that's how I think very much about strong documentary photography. It is actually an historical document. And that's where the coalition between Newport and that kind of perception that I got from encountering this book really came together. One was encouraged in the practice of social documentary photography, and that suited my aims and interests at that time.
Having the influence of David Hearn must have been really profound because he was a really prolific photographer. He must have had a big influence on you, did he?
I think his biggest influence was to create the understanding and belief that you could do it if you really wanted to do it. And the one thing that David always impressed on us was it was important to photograph things that you were very interested in or very passionate about, and perhaps which you knew a lot about. Because in such a way, if you understand and are somewhat, fascinated by your subject, you will make better pictures because you understand the meaning of the things happening around you, their significance. And he also fed the idea that you could become an expert on anything in a very short time. So that if you're going off to a country to photograph the coal miners of the Donbass, do your research and you have a strong starting point when you arrive. But I would never subscribe to the idea that photography is objective. I think it's a very, very subjective practice, in fact. Although I think one should always question oneself about the statement that you're making. And
that's right.
So not approaching anything with any kind of bias or trying to dispel any kind of bias before you start to work.
It's deeper than just subject matter in perseverance to create work. And I noticed that in your work. I was always interested in the way you really grasped composition and you really grasped the interaction with people within the planes and the thirds and the way you used the deepness of blacks and contrast. And I noticed in a lot of your work, there's a sort of a theme and a vein of style which runs through it. And I love the way you use people in different parts to connect, to train you, to move the viewer's eye around the frame. And I know that sounds obvious. I've always felt you were really deeply into composition, whereas I think we all are, but I just thought you always seemed to really work at it and were very consistent at that.
I think I've always been quite obsessed by it.
Do you know what? You can tell. I've always thought you were obsessed with it. And I mean that with pure respect,
Well, I've always sought to bring together content and form so that I had this marriage of the meaning, the information that the photograph is imparting, but together with a kind of very strict, disciplined, precise way of arranging the elements within the picture, hopefully making a more compelling image. It actually translates the point, what I'm trying to say in the picture, more powerfully to any potential audience.
And that's not easy. It goes deeper. When you're in a conflict zone, somebody's just lost a son and they're upset. You've got to switch into that mode.
I think you do it.
You've got to.
Now, let me think about this. There's no point being anywhere unless, as a photographer, particularly in a conflict zone, if you can't if you can't capture and record the essence of what you believe the situation to be, the tragedy, the inhumane, the grief, the aggression. And I think, through being preoccupied with this on a 24/7 basis, really, I mean, I would say that all of my time since I started photographing, even, walking to the underground or swimming or something, you're actually framing and thinking about the relationship between shapes and parts and meanings and putting them into a frame. And in my case, that was a 35mm frame most of the time. I always tried to frame. I don't like cropping pictures. I know it's a bit of a cliche to say that, but I always tried to make my picture, to the edges of the frame to the edges of my negative. And that's a challenge. And there are a lot of failures there. But sort of coming back to the question you asked, you need to be accepted by the people you're photographing, in whatever situation, you know. If I'm sitting with a family in a cellar in Sarajevo and they're expecting, Svetlana is expecting a baby in a few weeks' time, and they're trapped in the cellar and they have to walk 1.5, 2 kilometers to get water under sniper fire. They need to trust. You need to build up trust, but you also need to, not non-present, but to be, to fade into the background so that after a while people stop thinking about you. And then what you photograph is a more natural situation of people enacting their daily lives, really, under the various circumstances. I'm not sure that I've explained that very well, really. But all the time you are actually using your experience awareness of elements, changing elements, light changing, the body language changing, a person coming into the room, which can coalesce into making a situation which, if you record it, can tell the story, can say what you want to say about the set of circumstances.
You're seeing it before you put your eye to the camera, really, aren't you?
No, I don't agree with that. I don't carry around a frame in my mind. Some photographers do. You'll see with some photographers that a person's always in one position, you know, something else is in the same sort of position, and you can recognize that style immediately. But I really fight against doing that. I think that, it's something that Sarkovsky talks about in his book, The Photographer's Eye. I mean, I try not to do it. Let me put it like that. I'm not pre-visualizing anything. And I know I'm not, because when the arrangement of the subject matter starts to come together, you start to get excited. And that's because you're seeing something new.
Do you think that deepness was ingrained early on with your family influence?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I mean, we're all influenced by the experience we've had in life.
So you left university. What was next?
Well, I left university and went to work in London for a firm of property managers, which I did for a year or so. At that time, I was starting to feel extremely frustrated by, the profession that I'd opted to go into. I moved back to Hampshire, started working for a small organisation there, Hampshire County Council, as an estates manager. That became so frustrating because of the bureaucracy that I quit. I quit at the same time as I was applying for art schools. And so those things kind of came together very fruitfully, really. I didn't know how to make a living as a photographer. And to make a living as a photographer is important if you want to be a photographer, because you have to work out some kind of way to pay the bills while still doing what it is that you love to do and you feel is important to do. And the good thing about Newport was it was run without any kind of real academic content. There were no dissertations to write or theses, or I'm trying to think of some of the things that we had to teach at university, which I felt were extremely irrelevant to being a working photographer. It was a course that was designed to make a working photographer. And from day one, you were given an assignment called Man at Work, and you had to go out, approach strangers, photograph them in such a way that you clearly expressed the nature of the work they were doing and the person's personality, come back, process, make contact sheets in the same day, and show them for a crit. Now, we were so fortunate at that time. There were 4 full-time tutors at Newport. There were 9 students in my year. We had visiting lecturers, Joseph Kudelka, Chris Steele-Perkins, Patrick Ward. I'm just trying to think. Bill Jay, an old colleague and associate of David Hearn's. So it was an incredibly privileged and intense education. I think it taught a very simple form of communication. What is it I want to say, and what's the best way of saying it? And if you married that with your interests, and mine were about politics and society and news, I found that I started to produce pictures in my first year at school, which I could sell to newspapers. So, for instance, in the great blizzard of January 1981, I woke up, tried to open the front door of our little house that we were renting. Couldn't open the door because the snow was nearly 4 feet high. dug myself out, organized my cameras, put my cameras into plastic bags, went out trudging through the snow, photographing people in the snow, ended up in Newport Station. At that moment, a 125, which was known as the high-speed train, Swansea to London Paddington Express, pulled into the station and broke down, froze to a standstill, basically. And all the passengers had to be evacuated, and they came trudging through the snow like, it was like being in the Arctic. And I photographed that, and I thought, well, what can I do with these pictures now? So there was no way of getting to London. London would be the only place where you could get those pictures published. So I just hung around, and I went back again in the afternoon, and I found they'd cleared the line. And there was a train going to London. So I got on the train, went to London, went straight to The Guardian, said, I've got some pictures of a blizzard in Wales in the southwest, and the whole southwest of the country had been cut off. The Guardian ran it across 7 columns of the passengers being evacuated from the train. And I got an incredible enjoyment out of that. But just that kind of practical pragmatism, just doing it, learn how to do it. Take pictures which have meaning or significance or a news value, and someone else will probably want them.
Who was the picture of it then?
There's a man called Brian Crook. He was a dour man who didn't pay very much money for anything.
Did that help later on with the Observer?
No, not really, because they weren't related then, don't forget.
No.
I mean, the Observer was owned by Lonhro, and the Guardian was owned by the Guardian Trust.
That's right, yeah.
And the Observer was based in Blackfriars, and the Guardian was in Farringdon Road. My relationship with the Guardian started when I'd taken some pictures of Dickie the Mudlark, who was a man who used to, at low tide, in Newport, a lot of the dredgers used to come up. They used to dredge for shingle, and they had to berth in Newport to be unloaded. Because the river had very steep sides, someone had to level out the bank sides. His job was to climb down, and he was an old man. He's in his late 60s, I would have thought, and wade through this oozing, treacherous, glue-like mud, using a kind of, a flat piece of board on the end of a handle. And he used to drag the mud and flatten it into a level area. So when the dredgers, which I think were quite flat bottomed, came in, as the tide went out, they wouldn't topple over. So I took some pictures of this guy, and it looked in its own way quite dramatic. And I sent them into the Observer. And a very nice guy who was an assistant picture editor then called John Hodder contacted me and said he liked the pictures and he tried to get them into the paper. And a few weeks later, he called me and said that they were going to be in the Sunday edition. And that's how I made my contact with the Observer. And it was kind of, let me say this again, following that, then I had the sort of confidence that I could actually contact them. When I'd finished at Newport, which was only a 2-year course, I was in London in the autumn of 1981, and I just went to a phone box and phoned the Observer, asked to speak to the picture desk, and said, could I come and show them my portfolio? And it was a Tuesday, and a Tuesday was important in Sunday newspapers because they were never very busy. And as the week went on, they got busier and busier, obviously close to publication date. So you should never call an editor, when they're approaching a deadline. So the guy said, fine, come in. And I saw a guy who's called Tony McGrath, and he said, are you working today? And I said, am I working today? No. And he said, well, would you like to go to Oxford and photograph the guy who compiles the Oxford English Dictionary for us? And I said, yeah, I would. And all I had with me was a Leica and a couple of rolls of Tri-X, no exposure meter. And so I set off, went to Oxford, did some portraits of the man, came back, and they were published in the Observer that weekend across 6 columns. And that was really how my relationship with the Observer started.
What were you doing for the rest of the 80s? Were you learning the trade then?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the break I had so soon after leaving school to work for the Observer, it was really, really helpful because I did gradually learn my craft, and I always want to emphasize that making mistakes and getting things wrong is one of the best things you can do as a photographer because you probably won't ever do it again. So I've always embraced failure as a very powerful form of learning and evolving and moving on from where you were before you made those mistakes. So it's kind of reflection in action, if you like, to use a sort of pedagogical term. The great thing was when you started to work with other photographers who'd been around friend of mine, Neil Libert, for instance, you used to learn from them. You used to learn from watching how they shot things, and generally how they approached subject matter. But also, very powerfully, the influence of working with knowledgeable correspondents and foreign correspondents was in its way a great education and a kind of enlightenment. And so gradually, I think as the picture editor's trust built up in you to always bring something back from an assignment, the assignments I was given got more challenging. They started to involve foreign assignments, and then gradually assignments which involved covering conflicts.
I think it's learning about the expectations and what's expected of you as well when you're doing stuff like that, in learning the trade and building your confidence, but just learning how it's done. I say anybody can take pictures. The difference between being able to take a picture and being able to do it as a job.
Yes. The point is about working in newspapers and deadlines. You always have to come up with the goods.
Exactly.
But you usually have to do it in a very short time. You don't have the luxury of spending a month to try and get a picture.
And you didn't have the luxury then of digital. It was a little bit easier, but as you mentioned before, working with Tranny E6 was an education in itself. Moving into the late 80s and the 90s, that was a really prolific period for you, not just for all the awards you won, the places you covered, what you witnessed, the transition in the way you thought about things. You come out of the 90s a different person and a different outlook in photography. Where did the journey begin in the late 80s?
I guess it really had to begin with, yes, the prelude to the Berlin Wall coming down, the end of the collapse of communism in 89 and the run up to that. And as I gathered more experience and grew more confident in doing things, I became more adventurous, more prepared to undertake difficult assignments, had a growing belief in the contribution my own work could make in terms of broadcasting news and spreading information and asking questions about society, the world, political events. And I started to look for a broader canvas than just one newspaper. So I was trying to expand the way I worked because I was always a freelance. And I was contacting and working for magazines. I had an involvement with a picture agency. Initially, I worked briefly for Camera Press. Then I worked with Network for a short period, but then left Network and worked with Rex Features when Stephen Mays was the editorial director there. After that, I had a very enjoyable couple of years working with Katz Pictures, and then I went back to Network, to cut a long story short, and that was about 1990. I was covering the social upheaval and the revolutions, such as the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, and traveling further afield, and went off in January 1989 to drive across Eastern Europe from Berlin through into Bohemia, photographing the effects of acid rain, pollution, bitumen coal, open cast mining, uranium mining in Ronberg. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, Zach, actually. I mean, I started to win awards. Now, I don't think awards are important. They don't actually mean anything. They don't make you a better photographer, and they don't mean that the phone's going to keep ringing. But I suppose they can give you some kind of idea that you're doing the right sort of thing. But all through this time, I'm constantly saying to myself, how can I make better pictures? How can I do more important work? What's wrong with the work I've done already? I'm not very satisfied with that. It could have been done in a better way. I should have spent more time. I left too soon. And at the same time, I'd started to attract one or two clients who were picture editors or art directors on magazines. So I was getting different sorts of assignments than you would have done for a newspaper. I'm being given more time to do them. And I started to enjoy that. And I started to understand the value of, rather than in the case of newspaper work, where you're really thinking about one sort of image that tells a story or can illustrate a piece written by someone, that I wanted to build larger photographic essays and reportages. At that stage, I started to move away from newspaper work, as I said. I was working more on my own self-assigned bodies of work. I mean, there are many examples. it culminated in the work I started to do in the former Yugoslavia, which I spent from 1992 until 99 working on.
When you were traveling around doing the uranium mines and doing stuff, who was paying for that?
Well, actually, a lot of the time I was paying for it. It worked like this. I mean, you would come up with a story proposal. I quite emphasize here that it was very important to have your own ideas or decide that a certain issue was important and persuade an organization or an editor or a newspaper or magazine that it should be covered. Now, quite often, they wouldn't commit to sending you somewhere and paying for all of your expenses, although that happens sometimes. More likely was the fact that editor would say to you, oh, we can give you a guarantee. And a guarantee meant that they would say, give you £1,000, effectively to see the work when you got back, but without any commitment to publishing it. The great thing about that was that it freed you to approach different publications in different markets. So you might get one guarantee from the British publication, but you could also get a guarantee from the French publication, a German publication, an American publication. It was almost like a kind of fundraising that people do nowadays, through what do they call it? Kickstart, something like that. Well, it's not really a retainer. It's just a guarantee against seeing the work. I mean, photography was expensive, as you know. Processing, printing, because in those days, before digital, you'd come back, you'd make an edit, and then the prints had to be printed, and then they had to be distributed. In the earlier days, that was done by sending out small sets of actual physical prints. But latterly, we used to send out black and white slide copies of sets of pictures.
You were just running around Europe with bags of film then? I think people don't realise the costs in purchase of film, getting it developed, the post-production side as well. It took a lot of effort and work.
Well, you're talking about thousands of pounds, aren't we?
Yeah.
I think I alluded to it earlier. I mean, I'd never enjoyed darkroom work, although I learned to do it when I was at college. I had to understand the process. But my philosophy was, I can earn or learn more by being out making pictures than I can by being in a darkroom, listening to music for 12 hours, making my prints. Let someone else do that. I wouldn't agree with that now so much, because I find that one can make better prints using digital technology from your negatives. A lot of the printers could have made for you. And I think that's because obviously theirs were commercial operations and they'd only allocate so much time to making a print. Perhaps the one exception to that, just from my point of view, was working with Mike Spry at Downtown Darkroom.
So when you worked somewhere like Bosnia, you went in initially on a commission, or did you go in on your own steam?
The very first trip I did to Bosnia, the Observer asked me to go. And that's I think it was in November 1992, and it was when the first British UN troops went in to go up to Vitez in central Bosnia. After that, everything I did was a self-initiated assignment, because I didn't want any restrictions. You see, this is the other thing about, if someone sends you on an assignment, because of the difficulty of things like getting film back, as we had to do in those days, there were limited ways of doing it. You could either bring it back, or you could have your own wire outfit, which I never did, because you needed basically a support team with you, or at least the knowledge of how to use leave fax transmitters, but you'd still have to process on location.
Mm.
There was a third way, which was to give it to someone who was going back, who would translate it, transfer it to your organization. But I've lost too many films that way.
It's a scary process, though.
Well, it's like you go to an airport, you find someone on a British Airways flight, you go up to him and say, I'm a photographer, da-di-da. Could you take this package back to London for me? Well, I did that once in Sudan, Khartoum, and of course, whoever I gave the films to just dumped them. On another occasion, I sent films back with airline steward from Pakistan. For some reason, they ended up at The Independent. And actually, The Independent published one of those pictures.
Wow. You went on your own back, though? You didn't go, say, with The Guardian?
No, I went with The Observer.
And it ended up in The Independent?
Yeah. I won't go into how that happened.
How was that? How did that go down?
It didn't go down well.
We'll leave it there.
let's leave it there.
Yes.
I think I'm treading on.
Yes.
It might be difficult ground
Yes.
to say publicly. I'll explain it to you another time.
I'm looking at your 1994 World Press first place.
Yeah.
And you talk about being out on the front line and covering these events and the skill set you have to have as a person and as a craftsman. I'll use the word craftsman. You were against some heavyweights. There was a lot of good guys out there at the same time. And I'm looking at the World Press 94 and you've obviously got Tom, you've got John Jones, you've got Natchwe, Andrew Tester, you've got Eugene.
Not Eugene Richards.
You've got Eugene.
Oh, yeah, you've got Eugene Richards, but I don't think he was in Bosnia. But you've got, who's the guy with the hat?
Larry Towell.
Larry Towell. Yeah, but also don't discount the agency photographers, people like, the very good agency photographers, Peter de Jong.
You've got Luc Delahaye as well.
Gary Knight.
Yeah.
Luc Delahaye. Alexandra Boulard.
Pinkasov.
Yeah, Pinkasov.
But you also had a stablemate there. Was Mike at Network? I mean, you know he was at Network, but were you at Network then?
Which Mike?
Goldwater.
He didn't do that much work in Bosnia at the beginning.
No, but I was talking about Network. Were you at Network then, 94?
Yes, I was.
Yeah, so your stablemate. Yeah. I've got a confession to make about that 1994 World Press. I was with Larry Towell doing his edit before he put that edit into the World Press, and his pictures were on the table, and I kept putting my finger on the picture, which one with the kids with a gun in the air, and I kept looking at it going, that's brilliant. And when I saw it won, I thought, it's obviously down to me, but it wasn't. But I just remember being with him at the time, and he was deciding what images he was going to put into World Press, and he won it as well. So I look at Larry Towell's picture, and I see a lot of you in that, and I'm not saying that you steal his ideas, and he's probably stealing your style.
Don't think I knew who he was.
Yeah, he was definitely coming to. He was doing a lot of stuff on, was it the Mennonites?
Yeah. He did a lot of work in El Salvador before he went to Palestine.
Yeah. That picture, if I was going to sum a picture up, it's that connection with the people and the lines. It just reminds me of you a little bit in the way you shot.
I think I used to take pictures. You said there were a lot of heavyweights, but I don't make the same kind of pictures as them. I make pictures of people. One of the things that always used to strike me was that I used to arrive in Sarajevo as everyone else was leaving. And I'd meet John Jones, at the airport or something. He'd say, well, why are you coming here? Because I never went for action. I just like to photograph. What's it like to live in a civil war? What's it like to survive in a civil war? One of my big pieces of work from Sarajevo was called Surviving, Not Living. I wasn't interested in men with guns, even though obviously men with guns feature in some of the work. I was interested in trying to make pictures that would stand the test of time, which would still have meaning in 20, 25, 30 years' time. Interesting, I can tell you that the picture of the year, which Larry Towell won with that, it was between him and me for that spot, actually. Subsequently, I was the chairman of the World Press Judging Committee and also a jury member earlier. And so I got the kind of inside story, as it were.
You went back and looked at Berlin after the Berlin Wall as well, didn't you?
I'd always been fascinated by Berlin since when I was a kid and used to watch the Colonel Pinto. It was 68. There was, it was a dramatic time, the 66. I can't remember, was it 68 or 66 when the Berlin Wall went up? And obviously there were those early McCullen pictures. I was always looking for an opportunity to go to Berlin, and I got the opportunity to go there and photograph a band called Huey Lewis and the News. And that was in 1984. That gave me a taste for Berlin. And after I'd done the pictures of the band, I just stayed in Berlin for 2 or 3 weeks. I went back several times. For instance, in 1988, I did pictures of 88 of the Russians leaving Berlin with the cruise missiles.
Yeah.
I kind of built up a sort of relationship with the city. Then I was there in 89. And I think I then decided that I had friends in Berlin, so I used to go a lot. I decided to turn what had happened with my early work from Berlin, from 84, the events of the Berlin Wall coming down, reunification. In 98, I decided, as it was 10 years after the wall came down, that I'd try and I'd walk along the line of the Berlin Wall effectively and build a set of pictures about that 10-year period.
The remnants of what was.
Yeah, the interesting thing was when I first went in 1984 and I went through the checkpoint into East Berlin. I went to the top of the Telly Tower, that image that we're all familiar with, of the spike with the large circular, almost like a giant football on the top of it.
Is that Alexanderplatz?
In Alexanderplatz, yeah. And when you look down from that at night, you could just see how the Berlin Wall snaked around West Berlin. It was a noose. I come back to the thing I said earlier at the beginning. If there's something which arouses your interest, if there's something you find you have some sort of passion for or you're intrigued by, you want to explore it visually, then that's what becomes your motivation. As well as the fact that it may be topical, newsworthy, relevant. It's very important to keep, as a photographer, to be well informed, to educate yourself, to read a lot, to read novels. I was always very disappointed when I was teaching by the lack of reading that so many students did, I must say.
Berlin became a book in 1999.
It became a book, but I don't know if you want to include it. It became a book and I'm not really happy with it.
That's with Motta, isn't it? And you did Bosnia a bit later.
I did Bosnia, yeah. I'm much happier with Bosnia. But I mean, as I said to you, I'm probably rarely ever happy with any of my work. And I think that's kind of healthy, actually. Otherwise, how do you move on? I realized with Berlin I needed a little more time to do it, but I had a deadline with the publisher.
How did you go about getting a book deal then? It was a very different climate then. It was very difficult to get books published.
Yeah, I think first of all, you have to have a strong idea. You had to have a strong body of work. And in the case of the relationship I had with Motta, that was due to my Italian agent, Grazia Neri, who was a rather prodigious agent who I worked with very, very, very closely in the late 90s and early 2000s. So she had the contacts with Motta. I had the idea. I'd like to do an anniversary book. She took it to them. They said, yes, we'd like to publish that. It then became a traveling exhibition, certainly around Italy. Then again, on the anniversary of the war having started in Yugoslavia in 1992, we took the package to Motta again, and they went for that book idea as well, which also was a traveling exhibition in Italy and Europe, and in Milan, especially at the very prestigious Sozzani Gallery.
You covered a lot of the changing political landscape of Britain as well, haven't you? Really sort of dug in Thatcher's Britain. No,
actually, well, the thing is with Britain, I worked from sort of 79 through to 1997. And when Blair was elected, I basically stopped because I thought that's a neat period. And I wanted to move on then and do other things. Really, my last shoot on that was the night at the Festival Hall when Blair and his supporters, New Labour, revelled and celebrated their victory. And in Downing Street the next day, when, without being too much of a cynic, I would say rent-a-crowd had turned up to clap the Blairs into Downing Street.
There was a transition point then. Within a few years, you were travelling the world with Armani.
I think I told you earlier that I decided in 1999 that I would start to look for different things to photograph other than conflict. So photographing things which felt were more celebratory, life-enhancing, less grueling emotionally. The fashion thing came about really quite by chance. Actually, I said that I stopped doing, as part of the Thatcher thing, I did actually start photographing some fashion shows because British fashion designers were really quite high profile, sort of in the mid-end 90s. I started doing sort of backstage. It was the kind of Brit rock, what was it? What was the thing they had where all the Brits turned up at Downing Street, all the fashion designers, and there was McQueen and McCartney. Cool Britannia, basically, yeah?
Yeah.
There was a lot of European interest in London, design, the arts, Cool Britannia. So I started doing this black and white coverage just as reportage, behind the scenes. And people in Europe, it was being syndicated through Network and our European agents, and people in Europe started to pick up on it and publish it quite extensively. And I think the thing was, it was in black and white, and it had that retrospective, nostalgic quality, but also amongst the plethora of colour pictures, it stood out. And that's how I got involved with Armani, because the Italians showed that work to Armani, and Armani commissioned me to make a book called Armani Backstage. And that was published in 2000. And subsequently, I went on to work with him on his journeys to China and Japan, and did a big special at home with Armani in Milan. And then, of course, what happened then was that I started working for people here on the same sort of themes, such as, I was working for GQ and people like that. So it's self-perpetuating in a way.
I remember it at the time, and I thought it was really different. I remember seeing it the first time, and I just thought, black and white photojournalism in fashion, and the way you did it, I just thought it was groundbreaking. At the time, I was really jealous.
Well, I think it was at the time, and I think the thing was that everyone else who went to fashion shows stood at the end of the run, the catwalk, the runway as they would call it, and just shot pictures of people in their costumes and their frocks. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in the culture, the structure, the relationships between people, the industry as well, if you like, and the spectators and their behaviour. It's all behavioural, I mean, one of the most important books I ever read when I started out in photography was called Man Watching.
Elaborate on that, please.
Well, it's a book by, I've forgotten the bloke's name there, Desmond Morris, who was an anthropologist. And it's actually a book which is essentially lots and lots of pictures of human beings, illustrating various gestures, body language, movements, spatial relationships, to explain or indicate what is the transaction going on between people. And I always use that quite a lot when I'm photographing people. You observe all the time, you watch. You can see if an argument's going to break out by people's body language changing and the distances between them. And you prepare yourself to shoot them. I said to my students, use your ears. Your ears are very useful when it comes to working out what's going to happen around you. And they're very useful for picking up stories as well. You can be on the bus and you can hear someone say something in the seat behind you and you think, God, that's interesting. That's worth looking at. That's worth checking out.
I can also see that in the way you look at colour landscape work. You're looking for something deeper within the characteristics, the layout of the land and the light and what it's trying to offer you. And I've always saw that in your people work myself. I've just saw that early on. I go back to Armani. I think that black and white, looking back in hindsight, was a beautiful relationship. I think it had to happen in a sense. It's like, why didn't it happen earlier? I don't know. I've not seen the China work. Is that colour?
No, it's black and white.
Wow. I need to check that out.
I think there's a little bit on my website, but I'm not exactly sure, to be honest.
You're working on that, aren't you? Because
yeah, I am.
When I first started looking properly at your website, I know how much of a vast body of work you have. And when I looked at your website, I was thinking, where's all his work?
No, listen.
And I mean that due respect, because you have so much to celebrate as a photographer.
I am really lazy, really disorganized, very dyslexic, and not good with technology, and a bit ADHD. And I find it pretty hard to sit down and spend hours putting up pictures. I mean, one of the reasons I've switched from using the scanners to using the slide copying system is that it's much faster. My wife is always castigating me for not putting pictures on the website.
You've got such an amazing history of work. You need to celebrate it. Talking of celebration, your No Heroes book, that was an interesting book. It was almost like a sort of transition point and a very abstract, in my view, in the terms of the photography, what was in there. But that's like a timeline of your work and change in transition, isn't it, that book?
Yeah, I think, I made this conscious decision to start shooting much more colour. And I really haven't shot any black and white since 2007-8.
Yeah.
I didn't really want to photograph people anymore, to be honest. There's this thing as a documentary photographer. I said to you earlier, you have to gain people's trust. You have to go into quite difficult situations where the social circumstances are testing and challenging. And to get that trust, to go on that journey, it's quite emotionally exhausting sometimes. You go somewhere, you hang out, you have to hang out with people for a long time. Then you have to deal with I don't want to be photographed. I do want to be photographed. Don't do this. Don't take that. And then you get to the point where you can start to work freely, but that's often quite a long process. And I wanted to be freed from that, to be honest. I felt I'd done what I could say. I'd said what I could say. I couldn't see it or do it any differently. And so I went off in this different direction. And I don't know if you've seen that little publication I did called Zeitgeist.
Well, I was going to move on to that, actually, because the No Heroes was published in 2003.
2003.
Zeitline is 2017. That's another retrospective as well.
Look, I tell you what, Zach, when you're my age, everything's a retrospective, mate.
How young do you think I am, Roger?
Younger than me.
I'm not younger than many people, Roger.
Yeah, and you must give some credit to Patrick Sutherland with that.
It's a beautiful book. There's a certain imagery within that, and that's what I was thinking about Zeitline. It doesn't seem as deep as what No Heroes was in terms of the you approach the subject, and I might be off balance there a little. What was the narrative in Zeitline? What were you trying to say with that compared to No Heroes?
What I was really trying to say was, well, let me start and go back to No Heroes. First of all, some of the subject matter there is so emotive, obviously. Northern Ireland, the miners' strike, social history, poverty, demonstrations, all things which are still ongoing issues where there's a great deal of social inequity, financial inequity, things that should make everybody angry. I got angry yesterday when I saw that the head of a Deutsche Bank was earning 8 million euros a year. I don't think anybody should earn 8 million euros a year. Anyway, so I think in a way, No Heroes had that inherent emotive quality. It's powerful work. Patrick and I spent literally days in my apartment at the time with hundreds of work prints laid out all over the floor, just working out how we're going to sequence it and edit it. It's also beautifully printed, I have to say. The idea with Zeitline was that whatever the subject matter, you usually see the photographer's characteristics and personality and the way they deal with collecting the world in 2 dimensions, continuing, even if the work is abstract color, as it were. I don't like the word abstract. You can't really apply abstract to photography because abstract is bringing all lots of things together. I say extract. You extract when you take a picture of a black door with a blue spot on it. That's extracting something reality. It's not abstract. And the final picture in Zeitline is a picture which I call Brexit. I don't know if you know that picture.
Right, yeah.
It's a series of shapes of a piece of graffiti I saw on the wall, and one of them just looked like Rees-Mogg's eyebrow to me. It was my depiction of Britain falling apart because of Brexit, culture clash, the political clash, and the sort of civil war between. And then in the middle of it, there's a thing which looks like a strange parakeet, which is, I think, is a sort of chimera, which indicates social disintegration. And I might say it's clearer now than ever that it was the wrong thing to do.
Oh, for those who don't know what the Zeitline is, I presume it's German for timeline. Am I right?
Yeah, basically moving through time.
As a lecturer, as a head of the department, I'm not sure of your title off the top of my head. You were the boss, I guess.
Yeah, of documentary photography, yeah.
What was your purpose there? What were you trying to say as a photographer, as an educator, as somebody with a lot of history in the business and a lot to say as well? What was the sort of philosophy there with the students?
I think my philosophy was to try and explain to them what it could be to be a photographer. Again, I come back and emphasize only be a photographer if there is subject matter that you feel passionately about. I suppose I wanted to give people any opportunity I could to help them fulfill some potential, to maximize their potential. There are certain pieces of advice, imparted wisdom that I have always felt were important, that I acquired from people like David Hearn, but also from, simple practical advice that a Daily Mail photographer said to me once. The most important thing is be the first to arrive and the last to leave. That's a really good piece of advice. I've actually I left Haiti once, a day too early, during the Haitian Revolution, and I missed a very important element of that story by doing that. So that was a mistake because other people were staying, and I thought, I've had enough, I want to get out. I emphasized the importance of research. We did lots of exercises where I was trying to get students to feel confident, capable of spending time with strangers. I used to emphasize the importance of continuous experimentation, continuous practice. I found very few students actually practice their craft. One thing that used to, for instance, when I was learning photography, I'd walk around all day looking through my viewfinder and either taking or looking, framing and thinking about making vertical pictures or portrait format pictures. Virtually no young photographers today shoot in that format. And that is something to do with digital and websites and the physical form of digital cameras, I think.
Do you think now with digital that we don't acknowledge our mistakes more?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, self-criticism and critique. And also, I always used to emphasize to the students, it's good to have a trusted friend that you can edit with. It's a really important thing. You pointed out about Larry Towns' picture. You were there editing with him. And that picture's in the set because someone else said, you really should put that in. Because quite often the photographer doesn't see it themselves. Their involvement with the work is too close sometimes. And they might think another picture, which had been particularly hard to get, is more important being a set than one which actually tells a clearer story or a better story, a more powerful story.
I've always told students to make mistakes. I've said, accept your mistakes and learn from them and move on from them.
Well, anything other people do, I said, if you're a chef, you're not a chef just because you buy a saucepan.
Yeah.
You're not a photographer just because you have a camera. What about all the other aspects of it? I used to make a lot of mind maps when I taught, showing the interrelationship between physical condition, psychology, knowledge, and very much about how to construct a major project. And I would always get students to, at the beginning of the year, because I only taught the third years, actually, in their last year. Other people did other aspects of the course.
Were you writing the curriculum?
Yeah, because we did a revalidation when I took over. I really have to say it. I don't think I really have huge reservations about whether, a first degree level course is really an appropriate way to learn, certainly documentary photography. I think learning through doing. Many of the photographers, for instance, in Network had never had any formal education at all. Barry Lewis was a physicist. I mean, Salgado didn't do any formal photographic education. Again, it comes back to this thing, curiosity, fascination, interest, motivation, eagerness. I mean, trying to explain to students, some students, now, of course, there are exceptions in every group of students. There's always the 10% who are just highly motivated, highly working, get it immediately. And lots of the students that I worked with, had the privilege to work with, have gone on to do really good things in editorial photography, which I think is great. You can't be a chef because you own a saucepan. You can't be a photographer because you own, you're not a carpenter because you've bought a hammer and chisel. Learn your craft. Do your apprenticeship. As you say, make mistakes. Mistakes are great. And I was going to say, that is why I didn't like in education the assessment system, putting an A, a B, a C, a D, or a fail on something. I mean, at Newport, there was no marking, just feedback. And the other thing in Newport, which I didn't say earlier on when I was talking about it, you do a shoot, you bring it back. Let's say the classic, you've been out, you photographed the high street watch maker and repairer. You bring it back, you have a crit. The tutor says, well, you could have tried this, you could have tried that, you could have done this better, you could have done better. Go back and do it again. And we used to go back. And you would not be moved on to the next assignment until you had been back maybe 2 or 3 times to the same situation and re-photographed it. And through doing that, one learned that you've never maximized the opportunity in a situation. Even when you think you have, you can always do it in a different way, a more eloquent way.
A different day, different light.
Yeah, exactly.
Who else was on the course with you there?
In my year.
The London College.
Oh, right. Who was teaching with me?
Yeah. Who was there with you?
There were only 2 of us who were staff. Just towards the end of my time there, I recruited a very interesting young academic and photographer called Lewis Bush.
Very different, Lewis, in his approach.
Very, very.
Deconstructing everything.
Exactly.
He's just deconstructed a digital version of Burge's Ways of Seeing, is it?
Right. Yeah, I've got Ways of Seeing, yeah.
He's an interesting guy. He's so young as well.
He's very young and he's very bright. His approach needs to be married with practical photojournalism or practical documentary as well, because not everyone wants to approach photography from an academic point of view.
Do you know what? I think it's refreshing to have inputs like that. Somebody like Lewis has got a real deep passion to put out stuff. And I think that's important. We learned from that as well and gives us different perspectives.
Oh, absolutely. I would say I learned a lot. It made me think about things in a different way.
Absolutely.
You know.
Who was at Newport with you?
Well, actually with me in my year, or round about the same time, there was no one my year who actually went on to do, well, one guy called Jed Murray, who is sadly no longer with us. Around my year, though, there's a guy called Ben Gibson.
Right.
Paul Lowe was several years after me. Jonathan Olley, British photographer, works in medium format, who photographed in Afghanistan. Simon Norfolk, yeah. But again, you know, I didn't know him when he was at college. Well, I mean, the interesting thing was that one of my tutors when I was at Newport was actually Patrick Sutherland, who ran the MA at the LCC in documentary photography before Paul Lowe took it on.
Who's, in your view, the most influential photographer you look up to? Who's that person through your life you've gone, yeah? And who's happening now for you?
God, that's a tough question, because I think it changes. Seeing there was a different way of doing things by looking at the work of Cartier-Bresson. You know, when I was at college, I was interested by, you know, the Exit Project, Mark Edwards, actually, I think. I thought Peter Marlowe was a very interesting photographer.
Technically, he was brilliant. He had a similar transition to you as well, didn't he? Because he was black and white documentary.
Yeah, he was very... I found this thing with some Magnum photographers, he really changed when they joined Magnum, actually. I mean, Marlowe, for instance, he was an agency photographer for Sigma or Sigma, I think. And then he went to Magnum and seemed to do nothing but corporate work.
And then he moved into very abstract sort of square format.
Very abstract, yeah. I mean, I kind of was interested in Ian Berry when I was a student, just because of the subject matter. And I think because he was doing a lot of work with New Society, and I went on to work with New Society. Interestingly, although, you know, as I say, your ideas change. At the beginning, I found Ralph Gibson interesting, and I think that was really because of the and we talked about this earlier, really powerful graphics that he used in his work. I wasn't so much interested in his content, but I mean, just the way he organized shapes in black and white and tonally, I thought was fascinating. I think literature's had a bigger influence on me than a lot of photography, to be honest.
Is there anybody in the last few years?
Well, nowadays, I don't look at much photography because there seems to be so much of it. But I like an Italian photographer called Luigi Geri and Guido Guidi. And Eggleston, I think, you know, I've probably seen too much of it, but I think, you know, for the time when he was doing it.
What was it about his work you liked?
It's very difficult to put your finger on that, because you look at Eggleston's work, and whether it's a story you make up for yourself as a viewer, or there seems to be, you go into the picture and you can travel some distance, you know. There seems to be, what's the backstory here? You know, is it a dream? Was it, you know, it seems evocative of, it reminds me a bit of sort of like Wim Wenders kind of imagery in his movies.
Is it because it's got that sort of cinematic touch to it as well?
Well, I think the southern states of America might lend themselves to making, you know, I mean, you can only make pictures of the things in front of you with the color and with, I mean, I think, you see, the thing is that Eggleston himself, you know, I saw an interview with him once when he was being asked to explain a picture, and he just said to the interviewer, said, "That's the most stupid question anyone's ever asked me." I mean, you just have to look at the pictures and let them work for you in the way that they do. Do you necessarily have to articulate what it is about them? What is their essence? You know, you could say, you know, T.S. Eliot's poetry is really rather incomprehensible, but if it evokes a feeling or an idea, I mean, I think we can never tell. Every viewer sees our picture slightly differently.
How would you compare Stephen Shaw to Eggleston?
Well, I mean, look, of course I like a lot of Stephen Shaw's work, but...
well, we'll leave that one at that then.
I don't know. He's... I think he's got lots of very powerful, seminal, evocative images, but he's also produced a lot of stuff which is not especially extraordinary. It's, you know, for me, as a looker at pictures. You disagree?
No, I'm here. I'm thinking. probably as deeply as you are, but I'm trying to sort of think of the words.
I mean, it's quite hard when you're talking about this just to bring it when you're not looking at some pictures.
It's really difficult, yeah. What's next for Roger Hutchings then, is apart from sorting your website out and getting your archive together, what's next?
If I can do it, I enjoy writing, but I find it extremely difficult. I think I've had a very fortunate, at times difficult, challenging, but set of rich experiences in my life by virtue of being a photographer and many of the stories, assignments and places I've been to. I would like to put this together in a book form. I have the imagery. I need to put the words together and I need to edit it. I would like that to be my retrospective. So that it would be, experiential advice, strong pictures, untold stories, personal experiences, anecdotes, fun, critique of certain behaviors that I've seen photographers involved in, criticism of the industry, etc. So just a reflection. It would be my retrospective look, possibly at my life and at my work. But that's a huge thing to do because I told you, I'm rather an indolent person and I have to force myself to sit down and do this stuff rather than going into the kitchen and cooking. But I would like to share one last thing with you. Well, one of the things which was great, one of the things I found frustrating when the world went completely digital and I kind of stopped working for publications was you don't get the same kind of feedback. Not many of us get letters anymore, do we? Or postcards. We get emails and texts, and people seem to have stopped speaking on the phone as well, which I find completely frustrating. And the thing I used to like, I quite often used to get letters from viewers or readers. I've had them from readers of The Guardian, The Observer, well, you name it, The Telegraph, magazines, sometimes asking for pictures, often just expressing views about things. I think particularly during Bosnia, people were moved by a lot of the pictures. And I would add about Bosnia that there was one fantastic day when my Dutch agent, Marian Schutz, had managed to persuade every single newspaper in Holland to publish a whole front page of my pictures from Bosnia. So every single newspaper publication, and I have the tear sheets here still, had whole front page pictures. I mean, I'm saying the whole front page. So you imagine the broadsheet Telegraph and the whole front page was a picture under someone, hiding, crime, hiding, playing chess or whatever. You can't underestimate the power and the feedback you get from it by saying, well, perhaps this is doing some good. But anyway, you used to get this feedback, and I'll just read you this letter I've got after I've been to photograph the elections in Pakistan when Benazir Bhutto was elected. So, dear sir, the photograph of by Roger Hutchings on the cover of the November the 18th edition of The Guardian was better than any I have ever seen, and I would like to know if it is possible to get copies of the actual photograph, as my brother, at 10 years old, already a callous Philistine, drew a beard on Miss Bhutto in our only copy. Yours faithfully, Dominic Thompson.
What was the date on that?
29th of November 1988. You sometimes come back and go into the office and everyone had a pigeonhole for correspondence, and there'd be a few letters in there.
It's a beautiful note to leave it on.
It was always very affecting when you received them.
Roger, it's been a pleasure. It's something I've wanted to do for a while. I've always wanted to talk to you. I remember meeting you many, many years ago through our mutual friend. We'll mention his name. We've got to mention his name, Jez Coulson. We have to mention Jez. Everybody should mention Jez at least.
Jezza, the world's richest photographer.
He'll love that bit. He'll probably record that bit and put it on his ringtone. Sorry, Jez. Yes, we met years ago through our mutual friend, the photographer, brilliant photographer, Jez Coulson. And it's something I've always wanted to delve into your brain a little bit, and I'm really pleased I've had the chance to do that. And I wish you well. I hope you get your website together. And that's about the fourth time I've mentioned it through this podcast. It's been a pleasure, Roger.
Well, I think you should say, Zach, that the website is together. It just needs me to put the rest of my content on it. But I'm a little wary of flooding websites with too many pictures.
Flood it. Roger, flood it. Please.
Well, let me just say thanks. Thanks for spending the time to talk about all these things today, and I hope that works out for you.